water mains and gas lines and stabbing high into the sides of nearby office towers where they lodged. The phone system, the fiber optic network, and the electric power grid were knocked out. Ambulances, cars, and fire trucks were smashed flat by falling debris, and some were hammered 5 floors down from the street into the insane turmoil erupting inside the World Trade Center's immense bathtub, a 10-acre foundation hole, 70 feet deep, that was suffering unimaginable violence as it absorbed the brunt of each tower's collapse. The energy released within that wild, inaccessible core lit fires that cooked the ruins for months afterward. Outside of each tower's footprint, and still within the foundation hole, it demolished most of the 6-story subterranean structure, consisting largely of parking garages that were either pulverized or badly broken and left to hang. Deep underground, it also destroyed part of the Port Authority Trans-Hudson Path commuter line, a railroad from New Jersey that, having passed in a single-track tube through the watery muck of the river's bottom, emerged into the foundation hole and traveled to a station on the far side before looping back to a parallel tube and returning under the river to New Jersey. The path tubes were century-old cast-iron structures, probably brittle in places, and now at immediate risk of failure. If either of them broke catastrophically, the Hudson River would flood into the foundation hole, filling it at high tide to a level just 5 feet below the street and drowning unknown numbers of trapped survivors. Moreover, on the far side of the river, a wall of water would flood the Jersey City station, and from there, via connecting rail links, would circle uncontrollably back into Manhattan, rush through the passages beneath Greenwich Village, and take out the West Side subways from the southern tip of the island nearly to Central Park. Vulnerability to sequential flooding was a known weakness of the path system, and it had been highlighted in a report circulated discreetly among government officials after the earlier World Trade Center attack, the parking garage bombing of February 26, 1993. But maybe because such flooding was also something of an apocalyptic vision, and therefore somehow unreal, no defenses were erected against it. Of course, now it was too late, and immediately as the Twin Towers collapsed, it became obvious that even in America, apocalypses could come to pass. On the surface, the scene was just as rough. At the southwest corner of the World Trade Center complex, the 22-floor Marriott Hotel was transformed into a raw, boxy thing 3 stories high. Just to the north, across West Street, a pedestrian bridge gave way, killing groups of firemen and office workers who had sheltered beneath it. The streets buckled under heaps of smoking steel. So much heavy debris fell across the access routes that rescue vehicles were rendered useless. Major fires ignited in all directions. Simultaneously, air pressure waves shifted small cars and shattered windows for several blocks around, blowing powdery World Trade Center remains into apartments and across the chest-high partitions of corporate offices. The powder was made primarily of crushed concrete. The waves generated winds that pushed it through the streets in dense, choking clouds and lifted it to mix with smoke and darken the morning. Then all the white paperwork floated down on the city as if in mockery of the dead. The suddenness of the transformation was difficult to accept. It had taken merely one brief morning, merely 20 seconds of collapse, and now all that remained standing of the Twin Towers were a few skeletal fragments of the lower walls, the vaguely Gothic structures that reached like supplicating hands toward the sky. After the dust storms settled, people on the streets of lower Manhattan were calm. They walked instead of running, talked without shouting, and tried to regain their sense of place and time. Hiroshima is said to have been similar in that detail. The site itself remained frightening because of the confusion of ruins and fire, as well as the possibility of further attacks or collapses. But a reversal soon occurred by which people began moving toward the disaster rather than away from it. The reaction was largely spontaneous, and it cut across the city's class lines as New Yorkers of all backgrounds tried to respond. A surprising number of stockbrokers, shopkeepers, artists, and others got involved. For the most part, however, it was the workers with hard hats, union cards, and claims to a manual trade who were able to get past the police checkpoints that had been established earlier that morning after the first airplane struck. Few of these workers lived in Manhattan, though typically they were there that morning on jobs. They hailed from Staten Island, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, and the close-in suburbs of Long Island and New Jersey, and most had accents to prove it. From the start, therefore, the recovery site was what it remained, an outer-borough New York blue-collar scene. Overwhelmingly Irish, Italian, and male, terribly unrepresentative by social measures, and yet authentic. Arriving at the site over the first few hours, the volunteers joined with the firefighters and the police, who by then were shaking off their disbelief and struggling to take effective action. By afternoon, thousands of people in these combined forces were searching through the ruins for survivors, attacking the debris by hand, forming bucket brigades, and climbing over the smoking pile that in some places rose 50 feet above the street. At 5:20 p.m., World Trade Center 7 collapsed tidily in place, damaging some adjacent buildings but killing no one. By dark, the first clattering generators lit the scene, and an all-American outpouring of equipment and supplies began to arrive. The light stuff got there first: soda pop and bottled water, sandwiches, flashlights, bandages, gloves, blankets, respirators, and clothes. Indeed, there were so many donations so soon that the clutter became a problem, hindering the rescue effort, and a trucking operation was set up just to haul the excess away. People who came to the site in those early days often had the same first sensation of leaving the city and walking into a dream. Many also felt when they saw the extent of the destruction that they'd stumbled into a war zone. "It's like something you'd see in the movies," people said. Probably so. But my own reaction was different when I first went in, soon after the attacks. After years of traveling through the back corners of the world, I had an unexpected sense not of the strangeness of this scene, but of its familiarity. Wading through the debris on the streets, climbing through the newly torn landscapes, breathing in the mixture of smoke and dust, it was as if I'd wandered again into the special havoc that failing societies tend to visit upon themselves. This time, they'd visited it upon us. The message seemed to be, "Here's a sample of our political science." I was impressed by how faithfully the effects had been reproduced on the ground. But you could never confuse New York with a back corner of the world, and the ruins didn't actually look like a war zone either. There was sadness to the sight, to be sure, and anger, but there was none of the emptiness, the ghostly quality of abandonment that lurks in the aftermath of battle. In fact, quite the opposite quality materialized here. Within hours of the collapse, as the rescuers rushed in and resources were marshaled, the disaster was smothered in an exuberant and distinctly American embrace. Despite the apocalyptic nature of the scene, the response was unhesitant and almost childishly optimistic. It was simply understood that you would find survivors, and then that you would find the dead, and that this would help their families to get on with their